It was just another routine traffic stop. Or so Officer Daniels thought. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street as he flipped on his patrol car's flashing lights. The black sedan in front of him slowed and pulled over, and Daniels stepped out, adjusting his hat and walking up to the driver's side with the calm confidence of someone who'd done this 100 times before. But what happened next would change everything. The woman behind the wheel, a poised and elegant black woman named Evelyn Carter, rolled down her window and met his gaze with a quiet strength that caught him off guard. She handed over her license and registration without a word, but something about her demeanor made Daniels pause. Was it the way she held herself, like she knew something he didn't? Or the way her eyes seemed to pierce through his uniform, straight to his soul? Whatever it was, it unsettled him, and when he ran her name through the system, his stomach dropped. There was a warrant out for her arrest. Daniels hesitated. He'd been on the force long enough to know that things weren't always what they seemed, but protocol was protocol. With a deep breath, he asked her to step out of the car. Evelyn complied without protest, her movements deliberate and calm, as if she'd been expecting this moment. As he cuffed her and guided her to the back of his patrol car, Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a mistake, but he pushed the thought aside, telling himself he was just doing his job. Little did he know this was no ordinary arrest, and the ripple effects of this single decision would soon reach far beyond the quiet street where it all began. The next morning, the small courthouse was buzzing with activity. Reporters had somehow caught wind of the case, and cameras lined the steps outside. Daniels, now in his dress uniform, stood in the hallway, his mind racing. He'd been called to testify, but no one had told him why this case was drawing so much attention. As he waited, he overheard snippets of conversation, whispers about unprecedented developments and high-profile involvement. His knees grew. What had he stumbled into? When the courtroom doors finally opened, he took his seat, his heart pounding. The judge entered and the proceedings began. Evelyn sat at the defense table, her expression unreadable. The prosecutor presented the case, but before Daniels could take the stand, the doors at the back of the room swung open with a loud creak. All heads turned as a tall, commanding figure strode in. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Daniels's breath caught in his throat. It was the President of the United States. The President, flanked by Secret Service agents, walked straight to the front of the room, his presence commanding every ounce of attention. Daniels's mind raced. What was happening? Why was the President here, and what did this have to do with Evelyn Carter? The President leaned down and whispered something to Evelyn, who nodded solemnly. Then he turned to the judge and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to address the court." The judge, visibly stunned, nodded. The President stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This case," he began, "is about more than just one woman. It's about justice, accountability, and the power of the truth." Daniels felt the color drain from his face. He looked at Evelyn, who met his gaze with a quiet intensity. In that moment, he realized he was no longer just a cop doing his job. He was a pawn in a much larger game. But before the President could continue, the judge raised a hand. "Mr. President," he said, "this is highly irregular. I'll need to confer with counsel before proceeding." The room erupted into murmurs as the judge called for a recess. Daniels sat frozen in his seat, his mind spinning. What had he gotten himself into? And what would happen next? As the bailiff called for order, Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that his life, and the lives of everyone in that courtroom, was about to change forever. The tension was palpable, the stakes higher than anyone could have imagined. And as the gavel came down, signaling the end of the recess, one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the recess dragged on. Officer Daniels sat stiffly in his seat, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. His mind raced, replaying the events of the past 24 hours over and over. The traffic stop, the arrest, the warrant. It had all seemed so straightforward at the time, but now, with the President of the United States standing in the same room, Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been thrust into something far bigger than he could comprehend. He glanced at Evelyn Carter, who sat calmly at the defense table, her posture regal and unshaken. Who was she, and why did the president seem to know her so well? The questions swirled in his mind, but there were no answers, only a growing sense of dread. As the minutes ticked by, Daniels couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in the room. The reporters, who had been whispering excitedly earlier, now sat in hushed silence, their pens poised over notebooks ready to capture whatever came next. The bailiffs exchanged uneasy glances, their usual stoic demeanors replaced by visible tension. Even the judge, a seasoned veteran of the bench, seemed out of his depth, his face pale as he conferred with the attorneys in his chambers. Daniels felt like he was sitting on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way beneath him. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the doors to the judge's chambers swung open, and the attorneys filed back into the room. The judge followed, his expression unreadable as he took his seat. "Court is back in session," he announced, his voice steady but tinged with unease. "Mr. President, you may proceed." The president stepped forward once more, his presence commanding the room. He looked at Evelyn, then at the judge, and finally at the assembled crowd. "Your Honor," he began, "I understand that my presence here is highly unusual, but this is not a matter I could ignore. Evelyn Carter is not just a citizen. She is a hero. Her work over the past decade has saved countless lives, and her arrest is not only a miscarriage of justice, but a threat to the very principles this country stands for." The room erupted into murmurs, but the president raised a hand, silencing the crowd. "I know this is a lot to take in," he continued, "but I ask for your patience as I explain." He turned to Evelyn, his expression softening. "Evelyn, would you like to share your story?" Evelyn stood, her movements graceful and deliberate. She looked out at the room, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Thank you, Mr. President," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I know this is unexpected, but I believe the truth needs to be told." She paused, taking a deep breath, and then began to speak. 10 years ago, I was working as a scientist for a government-funded research lab. Our team was tasked with developing a vaccine for a deadly virus that had begun to spread across the globe. We worked tirelessly, often putting in 18-hour days, because we knew how high the stakes were. And then, one day, we made a breakthrough. We discovered a formula that could not only treat the virus but prevent it entirely. It was a miracle, or so we thought. Daniels listened intently, his earlier unease giving way to a growing sense of disbelief. What did this have to do with her arrest? And why was the president involved? Evelyn continued, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. But before we could announce our discovery, something happened. Our lab was shut down, our funding was cut, and our research was confiscated. We were told it was for national security reasons, but none of it made sense. Why would the government stop us from saving lives? I tried to find answers, but every door I knocked on was slammed in my face. And then, one night, I received a warning. A man showed up at my door and told me to stop asking questions. He said if I didn't, I'd regret it. I didn't listen. I couldn't. People were dying, and I knew I had to do something. The room was silent now, every eye fixed on Evelyn. Even the judge seemed captivated, his earlier skepticism replaced by a look of deep concern. Evelyn's voice grew quieter, but her words carried even more weight. I went public. I shared what I knew with the press, hoping that the truth would force the government to act. But instead of helping, they came after me. I was accused of leaking classified information, of endangering national security. My reputation was destroyed, and I was forced into hiding. For years, I've been living under the radar, trying to stay one step ahead of those who want to silence me. And now, here I am, arrested on a bogus warrant, facing charges that have nothing to do with the real crime, the crime of covering up the truth. Daniels felt a chill run down his spine. He looked at the president, who was nodding solemnly, his expression grim. Evelyn's story is true, the president said, and it's not just her story. It's the story of countless others who have been silenced, threatened, or worse. The truth about what happened to her research has been buried for far too long. But today, that changes. He turned to the judge, his tone firm. Your Honor, I ask that you dismiss the charges against Evelyn Carter and allow her to speak freely. The American people deserve to know the truth. The room erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions, attorneys argued, and the bailiffs struggled to maintain order. Daniels sat frozen, his mind reeling. He had arrested Evelyn Carter thinking he was doing his job. But now he wasn't so sure. Had he been used? Was he part of something much darker than he realized? The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but the noise only grew louder. And then, just as the tension seemed unbearable, a loud crash echoed through the courtroom. Everyone turned toward the sound, their eyes widening in shock. The doors at the back of the room had been thrown open, and a group of armed men in black tactical gear stormed in, their weapons raised. "Nobody move," one of them shouted. "This is a federal operation." Daniel's heart pounded as he scanned the room. Who were these men, and what did they want? The president's security detail immediately closed ranks around him, their hands on their weapons, ready for a fight. Evelyn stood frozen, her eyes wide with fear. The judge rose from his seat, his face pale. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice shaking. One of the armed men stepped forward, his face obscured by a mask. "We're here for Evelyn Carter," he said, his voice cold and mechanical. "She's coming with us." The room erupted into chaos once more as the armed men moved toward Evelyn. Daniels instinctively reached for his sidearm, but he wasn't wearing it. Courtroom protocol. He felt helpless, trapped in a situation that was spiraling out of control. The president's security team formed a protective barrier around him, but it was clear they were outnumbered. Evelyn looked around, her eyes filled with desperation. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "don't let them take me." But before anyone could act, the armed men grabbed her, their movements swift and efficient. Daniels watched in horror as they dragged her toward the doors, her protests drowned out by the chaos. The president shouted for them to stop, but his voice was lost in the noise. And then, just as quickly as they had arrived, the men were gone, taking Evelyn with them. The courtroom fell into stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone like a suffocating blanket. Daniels sat in his seat, his mind racing. Who were those men, and where were they taking Evelyn? He looked at the president, who was now speaking urgently into a phone, his face etched with worry. The judge slumped in his chair, his earlier composure shattered, and the reporters, who had been so eager to capture the story, now sat in stunned silence, their pens forgotten. Daniels knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not even close. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than he could have ever imagined. And as he sat there, surrounded by chaos, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to be pulled even deeper into the storm. The courtroom was in shambles. Chairs were overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and the air was thick with tension. Officer Daniels sat frozen in his seat, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. Evelyn Carter, the woman he had arrested just hours ago, had been taken by armed men in the middle of a federal courtroom, and the President of the United States had been powerless to stop it. Daniels glanced around the room, his eyes landing on the president, who was now surrounded by his security detail, his face a mask of fury and frustration. The judge was on the phone, his voice low but urgent, while the attorneys huddled together, whispering frantically. The reporters, who had been so eager to capture the story, now looked shell-shocked, their cameras dangling uselessly at their sides. Daniels stood up, his legs shaky, and made his way toward the president. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he knew he had to do something. As he approached, one of the Secret Service agents stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "I need to speak with the president," Daniels said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. The agent hesitated, then glanced over his shoulder. The president nodded, and the agent stepped aside. "Officer Daniels," the president said, his tone clipped but not unkind. "This is a mess, a damn mess." Daniels swallowed hard. Mr. President, I didn't know. I was just doing my job. I had no idea. The president held up a hand, cutting him off. This isn't your fault, son, but we need to figure out who those men were and where they took Evelyn, and we need to do it fast. Before Daniels could respond, the judge approached, his face pale but determined. Mr. President, he said, I've just spoken with the FBI. They're mobilizing a team, but they're as confused as we are. No one seems to know who authorized this operation, or why. The president clenched his jaw, his frustration evident. This reeks of an inside job, he muttered. Someone's trying to bury this, and they're willing to go to extreme lengths to do it. He turned to Daniels, his gaze intense. Officer, you were the one who arrested Evelyn. Did she say anything to you? Anything that might give us clue about what's really going on? Daniels shook his head. No, sir, she was calm, almost resigned, like she knew something like this might happen. The president nodded, his expression grim. She probably did. Evelyn's been fighting this battle for a long time, and it seems her enemies are still one step ahead. As the president and the judge continued to strategize, Daniels felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had been the one to put Evelyn in handcuffs, to bring her into this mess. And now she was in danger, real danger. He couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Mr. President, he said, his voice steady, let me help. I don't know much, but I know the streets. I know how to ask questions without drawing attention. If there's a chance I can find her, I want to try. The president studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, but you'll need to be careful. Whoever's behind this isn't playing by the rules. If they find out you're digging, they won't hesitate to come after you. Daniels nodded, his resolve hardening. Understood. As Daniels left the courthouse, his mind was already racing. He needed a starting point, a thread to pull. He thought back to the traffic stop, to the moment he'd run Evelyn's name through. The system. The warrant had come up immediately, but now he wondered who had issued it and why. He pulled out his phone and called his precinct, asking to speak with the officer who had processed the paperwork. Hey, it's Daniels, he said when the officer picked up. I need you to look something up for me. That warrant I served. Earlier today, can you tell me who issued it? There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of typing. Yeah, the officer said. It came from the Department of Justice. High priority, flagged for immediate action. Daniels frowned. The DOJ? That didn't make sense. Why would they be involved in a routine traffic stop? Thanks, he said, hanging up. His gut told him this was bigger than he thought. Much bigger. Meanwhile, across town, Evelyn Carter sat in the back of a black van, her hands bound and a blindfold over her eyes. The men who had taken her hadn't said a word since they dragged her out of the courtroom, but she could feel the tension in the air. She knew who they were, or at least who they worked for. The same shadowy figures, who had shut down her lab, who had threatened her all those years ago. They had never stopped watching her, never stopped waiting for the right moment to strike, and now they had her. But Evelyn wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She had spent years preparing for this moment, years gathering evidence, building alliances, and planting seeds of truth. She knew this wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. The van came to a stop and the doors swung open. Evelyn was pulled out, her feet stumbling on uneven ground. She could hear the sound of waves crashing nearby, smell the salt in the air. They were near the water, a dock, maybe, or a warehouse. She was led inside, the blindfold still in place, and pushed into a chair. Finally, the blindfold was removed, and she blinked against the harsh light. A man stood in front of her, his face obscured by shadows. "Welcome back, Dr. Carter," he said, his voice cold and mocking. "We've been waiting for you." Evelyn met his gaze, her expression calm. "You're too late," she said. "The truth is already out. You can't stop it now." The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "We'll see about that." Back in the city, Daniels was following a lead. He had reached out to an old friend, a journalist who had a knack for digging up dirt on powerful people. "I need your help." Daniels said when they met at a quiet cafe. "This is bigger than me, bigger than anything I've ever dealt with." The journalist listened intently as Daniels explained what had happened, his eyes widening with each detail. "This is huge," the journalist said when Daniels finished. "If what you're saying is true, this could blow the lid off everything. But it's dangerous. If they find out you're talking to me—" Daniels nodded. "I know. But I can't do this alone. And Evelyn, she doesn't deserve whatever they're doing to her." The journalist hesitated, then nodded. "All right, let's see what we can find." As they worked late into the night piecing together fragments of information, Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound made him jump. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when Evelyn's life, and maybe the lives of countless others, depended on what they uncovered. The deeper they dug, the more questions they found. Who had ordered the warrant? Who had sent the armed men? And what were they trying to hide? The answers were out there, buried beneath layers of lies and deception. But time was running out. And somewhere, in the darkness, Evelyn Carter was waiting. Waiting for someone to find her. Waiting for the truth to finally come to light.